There are ways to sort of read through the BS and sort of figure out what makes sense to you. And then again, you sort of look at the numbers to sort of back it up. So it absolutely gets misused. These are guys, when you have conviction about something, draft them. It's your team. Take the player you want. If I'm ranking Jerry Jeudy ahead of Tyreek Hill, if I feel that Judy's going to have a better game than Tyreek Hill, I'm benching Tyreek Hill for Jerry Jeudy in my own leagues, and I'm just going to deal with whatever happens.
On today's episode of The Pretend GM, I got to speak with Jamey Eisenberg of CBS's Fantasy Football Today. We discussed the importance of being able to differentiate between coach speak and reality, the way he approaches drafting two players that are on the same team in a good offense, and he gave me his golden rule for how he attacks fantasy football drafts each and every year. Just like you and I, Jamey Eisenberg is a Pretend GM. Well, man, I know I'm not going to bore you with like the same story. I think I've told you like 2 or 3 times. I was telling Adam before we got on. That's why we were talking about sports radio. Whereas like I still remember being the intern on the Joe Rose show where I'm like calling you and like, okay, Mr. Eisenberg, yeah, you'll be up next. You've been doing this for so long, and like not like to date you, but I think you're the longest tenured member of FFT. Is that correct?
No, Dave actually was on. So Dave has been at CBS longer than I have, and then
Okay.
he did some other things. He worked for NFL.com. He actually did some, I think it was called Wrestle Line. So he did some wrestling writing. And then he got to our fantasy department, right, I think a year before I did. And then I actually replaced Michael Fabiano. So when Fabs went to the NFL Network and NFL.com, there was an opening here. So you and I share something in common. We're both from South Florida. And so I was looking to stay in the area. My girlfriend at the time, I don't think we were engaged. My girlfriend at the time was still in college at Florida. I just graduated a couple years before. And so I knew she was coming back to the South Florida area. So I was hoping to stay, and CBS had an opening. I was, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but I was a newspaper guy prior to going to CBS. Worked at the Palm Beach Post, and just was a great opportunity. And so Dave was here a little bit before me, but yeah, it's since 2006 I've been with CBS and the fantasy
Wow.
department.
How does that even like how do you get to that point where I know you probably always had an interest in journalism, something to do with media, but how do you get to that point where you're like, you know what, I'm actually pretty good at fantasy football. I could make this a career. And was there like kind of that light switch moment where it just flicks on and you're like, I could do this professionally?
Probably a couple years in. I really was looking at the job because I enjoyed playing fantasy and obviously love it. But really, I was looking at the job opportunity as more of a foot in the door at a major media company. I like to say that I saw the newspaper industry sort of struggling and going in a different direction. I don't want to say it's dying because I hope it never does, but it was obviously at a point where there was a lot of changes happening in media, and the internet was clearly, seems weird to say it, but was becoming a different animal. And I actually had a job offer to work at Sportsline before CBS. Maybe it was CBS at the time, but CBS Sportsline out of college, and they wanted me to be more of a producer of posting stories on the site as opposed to a writer. I never wanted to give up that dream, so I turned the job down. And then come about 5 years later to go work there again, it was like, do I really want to work for an internet company? Because I always considered myself a newspaper guy, and it just was a good opportunity, but I never really looked at it as, okay, I'm going to be a fantasy analyst or a fantasy writer at the time, because we really weren't doing a lot of multimedia stuff for hopefully the rest of my career. I was really more of, can I get a foot in the door here and maybe do some other things? So we actually had, I think it was maybe 2 years in, our NBA writer left, and I threw my hat in the ring to, go be our NBA, lead columnist. When I took the job, I still wanted to, be out in the field. And I think we'll talk about, some of my approaches to fantasy, but I still wanted to be out in the field as much as possible. So I would still go to Dolphins practices. I would still try to go to any primetime Dolphins games because I couldn't do it on Sundays anymore. And then I was covering the Heat for CBS for, a couple of years. So even during the Big Three era for the Heat with LeBron, Dwayne, and Chris Bosh, I was going down to the arena through the playoffs, through the finals, doing as much as I could because I still wanted to be, what I thought was where my career was, going or still going to be as a journalist.
Would you say that's your first love, writing and journalism?
Oh, yeah, always. So people say, "Oh, you don't write as much anymore," and I hate that. I think I try to write as much as I possibly can. Because it's always been my passion. It's sort of funny, like when you have kids, and so like my oldest son is more of a math science kid as opposed to English and writing kid, so he hates it, and we fight all the time. I'm like, he's gotten in trouble. He's 13 now. He's gotten in trouble a little bit for using like some AI and chat GPT, and I'm like, I can do those things for you, and you're not going to get in trouble for it where nobody's going to see you. We can have these conversations and you can write it
Yeah.
yourself, as opposed to you trying to use these things that I think I can get you by. But anyway, different topic. But yes, writing is certainly my first and favorite love career wise. And um, as much as being on air and doing all the shows that we do, and CBS Sports HQ, and our podcast being on YouTube, and podcasts in general, those are huge highs. And you can't really beat the camaraderie of talking with your friends about something you love. But there's nothing for me that just beats, especially doing stories on people, and telling those stories. Those are still something that I really really love.
That's kind of how I feel with this as I've started doing it. This is episode 6 that I'm recording. And I've talked with people that I already know very well. And then I've talked to people that I have just quite literally only said hi to, and that's about it. And so it's been fun to get to know people and do that. I'm sort of the opposite. I'm definitely lean more towards the media podcast side because even if I write something, I think 9 out of 10 times I'm doing the speech to text thing and then letting Grammarly fix it because that's the best way for me to get my ideas out. You mentioned something though, talking about like your son writing, and it's AI is becoming, sure, let's call it the hot button issue, I guess, where a lot of people are talking about it more. I think younger generations are using it more. I've seen older generations wanting to use it more because you don't want to feel like you're being left behind or not understanding how something works. What has been your thought on it? Something that maybe, do you use it at all for like even grammar stuff or even fantasy analysis? Do you find a use for it for even fantasy managers?
I think we're all in an age where anytime you can get some sort of advantage or save some time, or find a way to, I don't want to say cheat, but give yourself an opportunity that it's not so time consuming. Look, that's what technology is about, right? It's to save time and make things easier for yourself. I haven't used it really in anything from a work perspective. I would not be surprised if, and I really haven't heard much from like our audience saying, "Well, I use this," or that type of scenario. So it hasn't really crept into at least my world yet professionally. But it's not going to surprise me at all if you look. We're in a very numbers based industry, and those things are easier to get by than sort of, okay, I'm using my eye, I'm using my instincts, I'm using my connections, and things of that nature, which is my always been my approach. But if we just get to a situation where how do I take this data and these projections, or using those projections from something that's just generated, it's going to potentially eliminate what we do if people really want to go that route.
Yeah, I'm still kind of figuring out like how I feel about it. I know it's supposed to just be an extension of you, a tool. Sigmund Bloom called it the intern that does all the things you don't want to do.
Yep.
But I think it just remains to be seen. I think humans are kind of that variable that we can always push something in the wrong direction when we choose to. But you mentioned a couple things here. Like first that I mean, you had a job offer right out of college to go to go work for Sportsline. You were doing your writing, but I've also seen you have a pretty analytical approach to how you look at fantasy football. So how do you make that shift where you go from I'm writing to I'm actually a very good fantasy football analyst? You may not say that about yourself, but I'm going to say it. You're a very good fantasy football analyst. How do you have like a skill set, something from your background that made you good at understanding and analyzing fantasy?
I was taught to, as a writer, write what you know. It's a phrase that I try to live by with everything when I sit down at a computer and try and make sense of what I'm seeing. And so for me, it's always been try and lean on what your strengths are. And I always approach this game, and I mean, we give advice for a living, right? So usually, I don't know how you deal with this. when someone says, "Hey, I like Devon Achan versus Christian McCaffrey," or I'm deciding between Devon Achan and Christian McCaffrey. I really like all this about Achan. McCaffrey makes me nervous. Well, you could tell the way the person's leaning already, right?
Right.
And so I think from the standpoint of like you kind of push people in the way that they want to go. And the way that I kind of look at this is like I always want to trust my instincts. And so for me, it's what am I seeing? What am I reading? And then the numbers kind of are the third part of this, So I always look at it as like if I have like I've seen a player do something on the field or see that their opportunity has changed because of an injury or see that a coach is saying something positive about them. Okay, do the numbers support that? If the numbers support that, then it kind of just pushes you all the way in. If the numbers don't necessarily support that, then it's really okay, how much am I really buying into this or how much am I not buying into it? And so when I look at it from the standpoint of, I do the waiver wire column every week, I do start sit every week for our site. So, two pretty prominent, pieces of advice. And so do I buy into what I'm telling people to do? Because I think that's obviously the most important thing. Like you want to have credibility. So if I'm telling somebody to go pick up Keaton Mitchell because he's getting a better opportunity for the Ravens, I better go do that myself and spend the amount of fab that I'm telling people to spend. And then if I'm telling people to start that guy on Sunday, Thursday, Sunday, or Monday, or in some cases Tuesday and Friday, depending on the week, I better back that up as well. So I always look at it like the numbers are certainly a big telling part of this. The analytics are a big telling part of this. My history as a journalist slash analyst, slash commentator, whatever, we've sort of become in this business is to still, trust what I feel like is there for me. So my process has always been can I talk to somebody that is going to tell me something that I need to hear? So someone close to the team, someone who covers the team, NFL analyst. I get the benefit of, and it's been probably the biggest blessing for the job that I have is working for this company. Is we cover the NFL. So I have so many opportunities to talk to sideline reporters who I've gotten lucky to be friends with and call colleagues to analysts who call games to now former players who have played the game. It's such a convenience for me to take advantage of those resources. And hey, do you mind if I bother you one more time to you know you talk to Mike McDaniel at halftime, what, or you talk, more importantly, you talk to them pregame, leading up to the game. What is something that he told you, about Achan's role this week versus Mostert? Oh yeah, the Achan's going to get an opportunity to, work a little bit more in the passing game. Well, you just made my job easier for him, So
Right.
it's, I think anytime you can take advantage of whatever resources you have, it's always a big plus.
You mentioned they're leaning on people, and that's something I know personally. Like I need to get better at accepting help from people. I'm not trying to turn this into like a therapy session thing, but I know that regardless of where people are in their career path or even how they play fantasy football, there's always someone that either supports you or challenges the way you think or just changes the way you even look at the game. Has there been someone along your career path right now that has just kind of changed the way you even look at fantasy football?
Adam Azer, Dave Richard, Heath Cummings. It's you say therapy. That's fantasy therapy for me. Every
Yeah.
every week, I don't know how many days a week you guys podcast. We go 5 days a week. 6, I guess, when we recap Sundays. And I will change my rankings generally in some way, shape, or form after every show because Dave said something that I didn't realize. Adam said something that challenged something that I said. Heath has a very different perspective, as somebody who's, so analytical and numbers driven. I think that's what's made our show successful, our group successful, is that we all sort of bring a different sort of feel to it, and as things have changed, we've all adapted in a different way. Um, but it's really, that's the biggest thing. I like I mentioned, I get a chance to speak to a lot of people. Probably the best asset that I've ever had, and I won't tell him this to his face because I don't want to, you know, let him get the ego boost. But Pete Prisco's a guy that's covered the NFL for 30 plus years. and he is as tied in and plugged into um, as many teams and people and personnel in the NFL. And I just pick his brain all the time, whether he knows I'm doing it or not. Sometimes it's just us BSing and talking football, and other times it's me actually asking legitimate questions and he doesn't even know it. But again, it's like, why would I not use this amazing resource? And so so thankful for him and the people he's even introduced me to. So again, sideline reporters that cover games for CBS. We have one thing that I miss. I used to host our Sunday show, our NFL, pregame show, and getting the benefit of talking to guys that are in the booth with Jim Nance and Tony Romo, and so the game of the week, in some cases the NFL, but the game of the week on CBS for sure. And what did you hear? And you get the chance to understand when some people are saying things that they don't want to reveal, and some things they're saying because they can't say them, but
Right.
read between the lines. But um, it's just it's I think in your best interest to do that. But yeah, just in terms of who influences me, it's those my colleagues, and even like the people that were adding to the show, and adding to our podcast network. Jacob Gibbs is unbelievable, and just
Yeah.
his data research. Dan Schneider, who is a big guy for us behind the scenes, but now getting a chance to be on air, and um, all the aspects of our fantasy football today crew.
I mean, you have so many great people that you work with, and I think that's also kind of shaped how you look at the game now, the way you analyze it now. But I think well before this, right? Like before you're able to talk to reporters, before you're able to have all these guys that you record with weekly and daily, there was a different way that you looked at the game. And I was thinking back to me just talking with my friends, and a guy will draft someone and just be like, I really like this running back. So yeah, I'm going to take him in the first round. What has changed between the way Jamey used to play football before, all of the outside effects that you have now with CBS versus now? Like how did you view the game then?
Really the same. It just was a little bit more legwork on my end. So I used to, when I had more time, so pre-kids, obviously, things change as your career changes, right? When you're
Yeah.
first trying to establish yourself, you're probably a little bit more aggressive in doing certain things. And, for me, it was always, as I alluded to, like I never really wanted to get away from my roots. So I used to, so for people that don't know how sort of the NFL week works, generally, locker room is open. You get some access on Monday. Wednesday's a big day. Thursday's a big day. Friday, they kind of just do a walkthrough and then you're done. So I would always, still all my responsibilities for CBS, I would block out time on Wednesdays to go down to Dolphins minicamp. We're based in South Florida. I would still, so I was coming from being one of the backup beat writers to the Dolphins for the Palm Beach Post. So still had a lot of relationships there. I would go every Wednesday to still make sure I heard the opponent's press conference. So what they would do is you get a phone call, not press, phone call, teleconference. So you get a phone call with every opposing team, head coach and key player. Defensive guys would be a little bit more frustrating for me, but I would try and generally ask an offensive question in regards to the Dolphins. But you get a chance to ask, and everybody's generally pretty respectful. So even though for somebody like me that's asking, more goofy offensive, hey, how many touches is Adrian Peterson going to get this week? So I would make sure I would do that. I would talk to as many Dolphins players as I could, even though if they're relevant or not, but you never know what something could develop. And then I generally would try and call a team or two every week and set up some sort of interview. And probably the best one I ever had was, just I said his name. So Adrian Peterson's rookie year, they let me speak to him on the phone.
Oh
Vikings did.
wow.
Their PR staff was great. And it was the first game he was starting. I think it was like 3 or 4 games into the season. So, he had been in rotation. I don't remember who it was, but he was been in rotation. I was like, hey, are you, when you think you get a chance to start? He goes, oh, I'm starting this week. And, obviously that's, pre-Twitter and all these things. Had that been there, and he told me this, like, oh, wow, awesome. Would have been, fun. So I always try to get to as many things still as I can. It's a little bit more challenging, but early in my career, it was every off season. If I showed you, I generally try to save a lot of my notes. It's somewhere in my house, but like I would list every team and 3 or 4 guys on each team who I wanted to speak to, and I would just call every team. This was, before emailing, I think was, maybe as personal as phone calls where people didn't want to talk to people anymore. Going back to your AI question, so it's
Yeah.
just texting and emails. I would call every PR staff and I would say, can I speak to X, Y, or Z? And they would say, oh yeah, we'll get you this person, or sorry, they're too busy, or oh no, you're just a fantasy guy. No, we don't deal with fantasy. You got every sort of answer. So I would say every off season, I probably 10 to 15, and did stories on those guys. Then we went from doing a magazine to not doing a magazine, so it was a little different. But I never really changed. This is something like I go to, until they'll tell me no. I go to every owners meetings because I get a chance to speak to every coach. Some GMs. I go to there's a trainer that's in South Florida that I see that trains a lot of rookies going into the league, and try and talk to those guys as much as possible. So any opportunity that I get to still do that, I do. But in the early days of my career when I first started at this place, it was first story. So not to go completely off tangent.
No,
First
you're fine.
story that I did was it Keith Byers? Keith Byers was the fullback for the Eagles, right? He
Mhm.
he took a job at a local high school in South Florida. I think it is Keith Byers, and so how
I
old
gotta be honest, I have no idea.
I'll check as we're talking. I think it was Keith Byers. Um, and I went. I talked to him about Edgerrin James. Just
Oh, cool.
he was the first guy I ever did as the start of the week, and so it was. Let me just again be who I am and talk to a guy that knows the league. And so he was like, "Cool, yeah, let's talk." So I don't do that as much anymore, but it's one of the things I miss.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it seems like you're so dialed into. I mean, one, you're almost more like a reporter at this point, going and digging for information. Um, were you kind of the same way before having access to all this? Because I know, like, the average person watching or listening doesn't have access to
Yeah.
stuff like that. So it's like, what do they do? Do they just really need to be on top of the news breaks? I mean, obviously, we live in a different age now where there's information every couple seconds on the various social media platforms. Is that something that, like, prior to having access to this, was that something you sort of dug into and you felt like gave you an advantage?
Yeah. Again, I'm probably I've always had this. As soon as I became a fantasy writer, I was coming off being a newspaper guy, so it was never like I didn't
So you're just
have these.
always
Yeah,
did, yeah.
and in some cases, like it was even more then because of working with somebody, or somebody else covered a team, and I knew that beat writer, and so I would reach out to them a little bit more. um I think the one thing, so for people that are young in this industry, looking to break in this industry, how do you get an edge in doing certain things? And we actually had this question in our chat on the show that you were on with us. How do you differentiate between coach speak and not coach speak, which is very, very hard to do, when you're especially this time of year, when everybody's hyping up their rookies, or guys coming back. Mike McDaniel probably hated Tyreek Hill when the season ended, and now he loves him again. So how much of that is, where's the truth in that? So that's a big part of this. Is how do you see those? How do you digest that information, and how do you sort of tell somebody that it's going to make sense? And that's, I think, again, where you trust your instinct, and going back to, okay, do the numbers support this? If we're just talking fantasy, so there's so much available to you right now. From all these different blogs that cover teams, whether they're around the team or they're not around the team. But, every team has some person, um, outlet that is going to, uh, Dolphins, blowhole.com, whatever the case may be,
Right, yeah.
that they know because they're either reading, talking to somebody, in some cases, maybe just a fan that loves the team. Those are easy things to sort of help you gain a little bit of an edge. It's a lot harder when you're in our position of there's 32 teams, and there's usually 8 to 10 players on every team you got to be sort of aware of. But that's I think the fun of it is how you differentiate the BS versus what the truth is, and sort of going from your confirmation bias on if you like a player, if you don't.
You mentioned, like, trying to kind of sift through the words that come out, right? And it's like, is it coach speak? Is it for real? Um, do you tend to see that people maybe misuse coach speak a little too much, or overrate it, underrate it? Because especially, like, right now, like, we're recording this in July, and throughout the summer, basically the only things you're going to hear from coaches is, we want to use this guy more, or this guy needs to get better at something. So it's just going to be these little sound bites, these clips that come out. Do you think that we maybe use those the wrong way, or misunderstand these kind of coach speak clips a little too much?
all the time. Without fail. Because we talked about Kyron Williams, right, on
Mm.
FFT, and what happened last year? Well, Sean McVay says he's going to be on punt returns, and that just well, they just drafted Blake Corum, and now the coach is saying he's going to be on punt returns, and we know he wasn't an explosive player, and his draft capital coming into the league, and so it was like, if you liked Kyron Williams, you're like, okay, I don't care about all that. He was so good in 2023. How is he going to be terrible in 2024? You may downgrade him a few spots in your rankings, but whatever. And then it's the people that were like, I didn't really like him to begin with. He was sort of fluky. Well, now I got all this new stuff from everything that's coming out of the Rams. Like, I'm out on Kyrie Williams completely. And so this is where, you have to sort of do your job. And okay, what am I going to tell my audience? What am I going to believe myself? How much do you fall for it? And so when you're listening to it, and you're watching facial expressions, and you're knowing, this is what this coach speak index, has been so
Yeah.
successful at doing. They're great. Such a benefit for someone like me who, lives with these things. Um, I think the one thing that you have to do is, okay, then you got to follow up. So how do you follow up? So in my case, I get a chance to make a phone call or send a text, and is this really the truth? And the nice thing about it is, if you really want to, people that cover the team will answer these questions for you. So it's not, don't be afraid to ask those questions. Obviously, every fan should not be doing that. So I don't want to bombard,
Right.
every NFL beat writer with, fan questions. But um, you see the opportunity to go watch a press conference now. You see the opportunity to, see you know, what it is. And for me, I've been doing this a long enough time. Like, okay, especially if it's an established coach, an established team, you kind of know, so like I don't want to say I can read Sean McVay, but I kind of know his mannerisms and things that he said that are the truth, just in the terms of this Kyron Williams situation. And then you look at history. Okay, so I think you brought this up, like McVay's track record has been to continue to
Just
use
drafts a
one
guy
guy.
every year.
Right. And so
Yeah.
yes, they've drafted a guy, and they continue to still use the veteran until the veteran breaks down. So like, there are ways to sort of read through the BS, and sort of figure out what makes sense to you. And then again, you sort of look at the numbers to sort of back it up. So it's absolutely gets misused. It absolutely gets, to a situation where, oh my God, he said this. Dave and I used to have this joke of there was a player, I forget it was, he signed a big contract, and Dave was like, oh, follow the money. And I'm like, sometimes they doesn't always match up, and
Yeah.
so follow the money used to always be like a phrase like we would, give each other a hard time about. But you got to know the team, you got to know who you're dealing with in some cases.
You mentioned there, like, obviously, one of the things that when we take stuff out of context, quotes like that, a lot of times it's just confirming the biases that we already had, or confirming our priors, or whatever it may be. I know that in this field, you're not really supposed to have a bias, but a lot of us do end up having some sort of bias. Like, I've heard anything from, I want young running backs, pass catching running backs, running quarterbacks, tight ends who get yards after catch. Do you find yourself sort of leaning into a specific player bias, or even just a concept bias when it comes to fantasy football?
Yeah, I think, once you sort of have success either in an advice situation or your own personal success playing, you sort of, follow that. So as the game has changed, we see how mobile quarterbacks have, sort of reshaped that position. You were talking about this. I completely agree. It's something that I early on was like, I don't want to take quarterbacks early. It doesn't make any sense. So 2006, 2007, you're like, don't reach for Peyton Manning, when you don't have to, when you can get, somebody a little bit later in the draft. And that's always sort of been a successful route for me. It's become a lot more popular, understandably so. Hero RB is something that's changed, my approach, as that's become, I think, more of a, I feel more successful way to play the game, as backfields have changed, and, we don't have these workhorse running backs. So leaning toward, taking one early, and I never really was a zero RB guy, but I know when it works to, amazing success levels, but just never something that I fully buy into, I don't know about you. Like I play in so many leagues. Like I try to have different approaches to almost,
You kind of need to.
a 30% share of them, just because like I'll stick to what works best for me, but I'll also try and, I can't do this job appropriately without knowing okay, why does zero RB work and what are the pitfalls, and why does taking a quarterback early work and what are the pitfalls, and so, even in leagues that, are personal to me, and I still try and, you know, be as competitive as I can, obviously. Uh, if it's to a point in the process, like, oh, I haven't done this strategy yet, I'm still gonna that might be the draft that I try it, and that's to a fault sometimes, but I try to still be, present in my job first and foremost, and then my league's a little bit second. But yeah, there are definitely biases. Obviously you get to a point where things work for you, and strategies work for you, and players who have helped you in the past. I mean, I think you said this about Ken Walker, which makes a lot of sense. People that got burned by him not being there in the playoffs, the Christian McCaffrey managers that got killed by him probably multiple times in his career. You're never going to draft those guys again. I don't
Right.
usually do that, but obviously it creeps in every now and then.
And I mean, I think the thing that like you were pointing out there is when you get into drafts and it's like that Mike Tyson quote where everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth and then everything changes. And it's like you'll go into a draft maybe thinking I'm going to pick a team this certain way, or I have my eye on these guys that I think are can have big years or be big values, but you can't control like what is going on in your draft. And especially, when you get into sharper leagues where everyone sort of has the same viewpoint, you need to sometimes be able to zig when you zag. So how do you get into one of these drafts, right? And how do you balance going for upside versus consistency? For example, like Heath Cummings was on, and he's just like, after round 6, I'm going for just pure upside. I don't care if there's a single safe player there. How do you balance this and maybe even just changing your draft strategy as you're going?
So we did a draft on Wednesday, and it was an interesting one for me at least, because we draft with a lot of the same guys. We have a great crew at CBS. Of our producers on CBS Sports HQ, and guys that do like our NFL product, and you know probably about 17, 18 guys that do our 12 team drafts. And so yesterday or Wednesday's draft, I know I asked you were busy, but I tried to get a couple other analysts from around the league. So Joey Wright did it with us, um, Joe Pisapia and Jake Seeley. So I knew we are going to get a little bit of variance of what I can typically predict who's going to take who. So I had the 12th pick. I'm not a quarterback early guy, and one philosophy that kind of works for me is not taking a quarterback and a tight end in the first 5 rounds. I know a lot of people sort of talk about that. So it came to the 3-4 turn. I started with Ashton Genty and Amon-Ra St. Brown at the 12th pick, and I didn't love the value for the receivers, didn't love the value for the running backs. I would have taken Ken Walker, for example, if he was there. So it was, you know what? I'm going to take the two best players who have the most upside, and it was Lamar Jackson and George Kittle. And that immediately from that point forward, everything was different from any draft I've done already this offseason, because now I'm
That's
usually,
so funny. I did the exact same thing for the Football Guys
yeah,
magazine draft. I got in the third round. I was okay, Josh Allen, and then George Kittle, and I was just like, I I never do this. I hate
yeah.
doing this.
And it was, it was a little bit of a challenge. And then so the next turn comes around, and I'm like, okay, now I'm chasing receiver. We, it's 3 receiver league. I'm chasing receiver. I didn't really care about a second running back. The two top guys I had in my rankings were Jamison Williams and David Montgomery. And I'm like, you know what? There's a real draft. I'll probably take Jamison, not even worry. Or sorry, probably take Montgomery, not even worry about it. You know what? I don't want to go all in on the Lions. There could be a little bit of regression. So I'm going to go a different route here again. And so it was like everything that sort of, the way that it was falling was not something that I would have planned for or expected or thought about going into it. And it was fun. It's just, again, mock drafts are obviously a little bit different. You're trying to do some different things. Um, did a draft for football diehards. My first two picks were Bijan Robinson and Trey McBride, picking I think fourth or fifth. And so it was like, oh, I love that. Two position advantages. Maybe the number one running back. My number one tight end. And then it was okay. Now I'm chasing receiver, and it was not something where I like to be. I like to be pretty secure at that spot. So any like you said, drafts are living organisms. You never know how they're going to unfold and what's going to happen. I think if you go in with a rigid strategy of this is what I'm going to do, you end up failing. You got to sort of read and react. And I like what Heath said. You're looking for upside. I don't necessarily adhere to the strategy. I don't know how you are, but it's either you when you're drafting, you win or you lose. To me, the waiver wire is so important. I don't think I need to come out of my draft with I have the most upside team. You got to have a little bit of a floor in some cases. So I think like in the fishbowl, you're in a 5,000 person tournament, best ball. You obviously want to draft for clearly upside, so that it's win or go home. But you could still get hot in the playoffs, as we've seen. Waiver wire guys will come on and help you win. So that's sort of an approach for me too.
You mentioned in that you've had an example, right, of David Montgomery, Jameson Williams, two players in the same team. We've gotten this as a mailbag question before. Is that something, how do you feel about that? Because I've heard some people say like, I hate to get two players in the same team because you're just sort of, splitting that offense, or you get the volatility of, right, like it's a good game for the Lions, the bad game for the Lions means it's a bad or good game for your team. Do you care about that when you get into a draft, or is it just overall, hey, this is a good player, good value, like let's just do it?
100%. The latter, good player, good value. So in the case of St. Brown and Montgomery, like I said, this was just something that consciously I was going away from. And I even wrote about it in our draft recap. Real draft, I would have taken Montgomery and St. Brown. We've seen those guys clearly coexist at a very successful level. Montgomery scored 25 touchdowns in 28 games with the with the Lions. He's going to be
Right.
fine. Um, Taking two receivers without necessarily committing to the quarterback, we've seen many examples either way. Go back to this years ago. There was Jordy Nelson got hurt. Aaron Rodgers was terrible. That one season, I know it was easy thing that stuck out to me, for example. But it obviously works. I mean, imagine how happy you would be with Jamar Chase, T Higgins, and Joe Burrow, and you can do
Right.
that. I think that's more of a best ball strategy. More of a fishbowl strategy. Trying to win a big tournament. DFS obviously. In redraft, it could over the course of a season can come back to hurt you. But if the value is good enough, you should not pass up those players.
I think the my favorite thing that I've heard from someone, because I used to be the I'm never drafting two players from the same team ever kind of guy. I had to open up my thought process a little more on that, and because like just the way it was put to me was so simple and so easy. It was like, well, let's use the Bengals for example. Do you like Jamar Chase? Yeah. Do you like T Higgins? Yeah. Do you like Joe Burrow? Well, yeah. So you think all three of them are going to be good? Yeah. Cool, man. Like just pick them.
Yep.
It doesn't need to be that difficult. And I think sometimes we just, especially like when we are analyzing, we are going to over analyze a little bit. And like you said, obviously there does need to be context. Like there does need to be gray area where sometimes it's not going to be as valuable for you, or it's going to be more valuable in a big tournament like that. But I know this is one of the things that I think in my home leagues, people would always say, "Oh, that's such a huge mistake, man. You got two Dolphins on your team, or you got two of this player on your team." I think sometimes we get a little confused, but what are the biggest mistakes that you see fantasy managers making year after year after year that you're just like, guys, please stop doing this?
Name over game. Fall in love with guys that have done something previously and maybe not have the chance to replicate it. And clearly there are examples the other way. I mean, Derrick Henry has been amazing, every year almost of his career. Mike Evans has been amazing almost every year of his career. So you have to I think sort of compartmentalize certain situations, certain players. But I always tell people, if you it's going back to what we were talking about, like with giving advice. Like if you have a feeling on some player, it's your fantasy team. So
Right.
live and die with what you want to do. Don't necessarily read a magazine or read an advice, a column or listen to a podcast and let those people sway you. Because if it goes the other direction and it doesn't work out, now you're blaming them. Now you're, blaming people like
Right.
us, because we had a feeling on something. Well, it didn't work out for us either. We're obviously not gonna, be happy about it. But I never want to be in a situation where, and this is, me from my life. Like I don't want someone to dictate how I'm going to do something. If I have the opportunity to control my own fate, I'm going to do it. So trust your instinct and trust your gut. If you really believe in a player, you know, you had a very compelling case on our show for Devon Achane and why he should be drafted ahead of Christian McCaffrey. And I don't think we're going to see that very often. But made me rethink it a little bit because again, it's a very strong case. What he did with Tua, I mean, I know the numbers myself. 22.6 points per game. He was awful when Tua wasn't there. We know Tua's got a potential to miss some time. But you know
Right.
what? If Tua plays 13 plus games, 16 plus games, the entire season, 16 plus games, if he plays the entire season, Devon Achane may be the number one player in fantasy, and so you're going to feel really good about that hitting. For me, it's if McCaffrey bounces back to whatever extent that he bounces back to, well, you probably got the best player in fantasy. So these are guys when you have conviction about something, draft them. And I think the biggest mistake that people fall into is like, I don't really know if I love this guy, but I think I do. But this, analyst who I trusted for years doesn't really love him. It's your team. Take the player you want.
Is that sort of your golden rule to just do what you want, take the players you want, follow your gut?
You have to. I mean, again, I can only blame myself. I can't blame, I'm
Right,
not gonna, send Alfredo Brown an email and say you ruined my team. Um, but we get that all the time. You told me to draft this guy. Yes, I told you to draft this guy. I didn't hit the button for you.
right,
And so if you were on the fence, I mean, think about this. I don't know where you were on Marvin Harrison last year. I thought Marvin Harrison was going to be a good rookie. Situation set up
yeah,
perfectly. He's walking into being the number one receiver. He was the first receiver
tons of
drafted.
volume.
Everything on paper looked great, but he wasn't good, or he
Right.
wasn't dominant. Okay, I know I'm wrong. Believe me, I drafted enough Marvin Harrison to know that it ruined those teams. But it was because I wanted to draft Marvin Harrison, and that's how I approached it. If somebody had said to me, Marvin Harrison is going to struggle, well, obviously I would try and listen to that. But I knew going in, this is what I thought of him, and I made the mistake, and I was wrong.
I mean, that's also sort of the process over results approach that people take. Because I mean, if you have a process that you know works, more often than not, that process is probably going to be right. So I mean, you can't just change everything that you know or do or what you've had success because of one result. And I think that's something that um as humans, we do it a little too much. We'll just play the result and just like you mentioned before, Christian McCaffrey got hurt. Well, I'm never going to draft him again. Well, right, was the process correct? Was he not the best player for you to draft? He just happened to get hurt. It's I think that's the big thing is we try to control the things we can't control as fantasy players. When in reality, it's just like just keep your process, man. Like you're going to get it. I know everyone has a different process for how they look at the game in season too, because that's I think where you actually win. Where you set up, where you draft is just kind of like that's being a GM for an NFL team. No one ever looks at a team that wins the Super Bowl and it's just like the GM really did it. No, it's like the coach did it, the players did it. It's kind of the ones who got you there throughout the week. So, what's your process? I would say I'm going to combine two of the questions here, right? It's like, what's your process when you're looking at waiver wire pickups, or even looking at a trade to pursue? Like, how do you look at your team and go, okay, I need to make some changes here. How do you even start that?
So I think, if you're early in the season, it's how are you looking at some of these guys that may have come out of nowhere? So I'll go back to last year. We usually go by about like 60-65% availability in our leagues. I'm sorry, 60-65% rostered or fewer in our leagues.
Right.
And so week one, you have the Isaiah Likely 2 touchdown game, and Jordan Mason had the first, sort of solid game. Was, I think there was a little bit of question mark of who's going to be the guy for the 49ers at that point, if I'm not mistaken. But he has the solid game there. So he was still in a range of guys that we could say pick up, even though we were telling people to draft him. And I remember Dave and I having this conversation of who should you spend more fab on. And Dave was like, Likely, because McCaffrey may come back. I was like, Mason, because if you get the player at that position, you're going to have probably a little bit more success, based on that offense, et cetera. So for me, it was okay. I could see the path that way. I'll probably spend a little bit more fab as the season goes on. You know what your team is at this point, right? So are you a playoff contender? Are you looking more toward the back half of the season at this point? Are you just needing to sort of, buy yourself a win, and how much fab do you invest in that point? So I think it all comes down to, a certain situation based on, that time of year, and whatever your roster or your team may be in the standings. I think, to use what Heath said, like, you're always looking for upside, right? So who's going to be the guy that can step in and be a starter for several weeks? How much fab do you have at that point? When it comes to trades, how much are you willing to give up, to, sort of plug a hole versus, again, looking latter half of the season, so when you're trying maybe to trade for a handcuff, or trying to maybe trade for a guy that you think may, eventually, pop off or have a chance, so it's sort of case by case. But I think always you should be making these moves either A, to, fix an immediate situation, which is probably what most people are doing, or if you have the luxury of it, you're looking more toward, okay, what can help me in weeks 14, 15, 16, and maybe win a championship.
I think I've found myself sort of leaning towards waiver wire earlier in the season and trades later in the season, because I think like trades, people just eventually start to sour on players, and you can sort of look ahead and be like, oh, okay, well, there's a good upcoming fantasy playoff schedule for this guy. He'll probably have that bounce back. Whereas like waiver wire, I don't know if it's just coincidence or if it's just a thing that happens consistently here with the NFL, but typically by around like weeks 2, 3, 4, you always see some of these guys just sort of pop up, not out of nowhere, but they go from being a guy that maybe you were thinking about holding on your bench to that's actually a starting running back the rest of the season, where it's guys like Chase Brown, Bucky Irving. You mentioned Jordan Mason as another guy. I think that was another one that people were getting pretty early. But we did the same thing. I think it was the year before that with like Kyron, a lot of these guys. And the someone told it to me one year that it's just like, well, you're getting the most value out of your early waiver wire pickups because you're keeping them for the full season typically if they do hit. So it's like it's someone that just gives you such a higher return. And I always end up seeing so many people holding on to their weight, their fab. And you get to the end of the year and it's like, cool, congrats on spending 80% of your fab on Ty Chandler in week
Yep.
15. Like, did that really help you? So I've found myself leaning towards that a little bit more. I don't know if that's something. Have you noticed any sort of trend like that with yourself?
I mean, you certainly see it. The thing that's, I always find interesting with some of these players, so we're all going to draft these handcuff running backs, right? Whether it's your own handcuff or somebody else. And then those are the guys that get dropped, right? So there was probably a lot of late round flyers on Isaac Guerrero last year in
Yeah.
drafts. And then Jordan Mason's doing what he's doing, and maybe McCaffrey's coming back, and then Guerrero gets dropped. And so now it's the people that are holding on to their fab that have a chance to get those guys. So a lot of it is knowing your league. You know kind of how your league is going to spend and how aggressive they'll be in trades. And so it sounds like, in your league, for example, you're going to be maybe active in trade because your league probably does that, year over year. There are some leagues that just don't do it for whatever reason, and so obviously format's different. Dynasty, you're going to get a lot more trade,
Right.
prospects as the year goes on. Keeper leagues, more trades because people that are out of it are going to look to maybe get some better keepers for some, high end talent that they can't keep. But yeah, you definitely see that for sure. And you brought up some really good examples. Puka Nakua. Think about what he was
Oh
week
yeah.
one. Oh, fifth round rookie. Oh my gosh, can he do this again? Well, if you spend a lot of fab on him, yeah, he did it again, and he continues to do it. Go back to Odell Beckham, his rookie season, and what he was injured, hamstring injury, 2013. All of a sudden, week 4, week 5, whatever it was, he pops up, and my gosh, he was a league winner. So there are, you know, earlier season, and I think you said it best. You're getting them for the majority of the year. So if they hit, we've seen a lot of guys, Isaiah Likely, for example, who, had some good moments, but you weren't starting him, and he didn't, build off that 2 touchdown game or at least sustain that level of play from that 2 touchdown game. So there's going to be, it's again, it's a game. It's a process. And so sometimes you'll have success with that and sometimes you won't.
But you just like sent me back down memory lane because that Odell Beckham waiver wire pickup was the thing that I think pissed off all my friends to the point where they're like, "Cool, we're not trading with you anymore.
Right.
Like we don't mess." And like as soon as they found out that I was doing stuff in the fantasy industry, they're like, "Yeah, that makes sense now." Um, I know that like the questions that we get the most probably are waiver trades, and then who do I start and sit, right? How do you balance those decisions? Because I know there's a lot of times where it's like, well, you mentioned before name versus game, right? There's a lot of times where you'll be sitting there in a make or break week. Well, this is, your quote stud that you drafted in the third round, but he's been really, kind of lackluster over the last few weeks. And this is the new hotness over here that I picked up off the waiver wire a week ago. What's the process like trying to make that starting decision? I know a lot of it is, I'm sure, people are leaning in one direction or the other. For you personally, how do you make that choice?
I mean, I'll again go back to what my research has told me, so
Yeah.
I'm a big intangible guy, so I'll look for history versus team, so if it's somebody's been in the league for a long time, Mike Evans struggles versus the Saints year over year. A lot of that is Marshawn Lattimore, but history is a big part of this. What's has a player, been struggling because of lack of opportunities, quarterback struggling, offensive line struggling, so is there circumstances why I may be considering benching my stud player versus someone who I just picked up off the waiver wire, so like I'm sure a lot of people had some struggles last year versus benching Tyreek Hill versus starting Jerry Jeudy at the end of the season. So Judy's obviously on this monster stretch, but at some point he's going to struggle, or at some point the Browns may bench, Jameis Winston, or at some point X, Y, and Z may happen. At some point Tyreek Hill may actually become the guy that I drafted and the superstar that he's supposed to be. Well, you probably lost your league because of that, because you were so stuck in your ways and being stubborn. Anytime somebody asks me a question, and if it's not their, hey, I like this player, but I'm on the fence, so I'm not pushing them one way. It's just black and white. Who should I start, Jerry Jeudy or Tyreek Hill? If I like Jerry Jeudy better than Tyreek Hill, you asked me the question. So you have to live with the consequences. Don't come back and say, you told me the wrong thing. Well, then don't ask me, and that's just
Right.
kind of always been my approach of, I will help you till I'm blue in the face if you ask. That's my job. My job is to help you. But if you're going to be upset about what I tell you because process over results, if I feel like this is going to be what happens, either sink or swim with what I tell you, or don't. But for me, it's always, how, again, I try to be true to what I'm telling, my audience. If I'm ranking Jerry Jeudy ahead of Tyreek Hill, if I feel that Judy's gonna have a better game than Tyreek Hill, I'm benching Tyreek Hill for Jerry Jeudy in my own leagues, and I'm just gonna deal with whatever happens.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of it is just gather as much information, connect as many dots as you can. And I think typically while you're doing that, your gut is sort of making you lean towards one direction or the other, anyways. Which, I mean, that's kind of where I end up doing things as well. Like, especially if I'm ranking, starting, whatever it is, that's where I tend to lean, unless some big data point just sends me in the exact opposite direction to tell me I'm wrong. Uh, but when you're wrong about a player, what's that process like to go back and just be like, okay, why did I miss? Because sometimes you can't always just look at that miss and be like, well, now I've learned this lesson for the future. I'll remember this every single time. It's not that simple. So what's that process like for you?
Frustrating. I mean, anytime you're wrong, it's never fun. We used to do a sort of like a recap of start set of, the players that I got right, the players I got wrong, and I'm never one. I don't know how you are. I'm never one to shy away from. Yeah, I was wrong. And here's
Yeah.
why. Here's why this may not have been the case. Yes, Mike Evans always thinks against the Saints. Well, today he was great, and he caught a 60-yard touchdown, and it was one target on. He had three targets in the game, and he caught one of those for a 60-yard touchdown. Am I wrong because I said he was going to struggle because he had one big play, or am I, right because he didn't have many opportunities, but he was successful in that one thing? So it's all, sort of how you sort of, I think, put it in perspective of why you were wrong. Trying to think of like a big miss that stands out. There's been a lot of them. um, Sometimes it's, this defense has been struggling. Like Adam brought up, for example, I forget who the early season schedule was, but how the Titans run defense has been good when Simmons has been healthy. And,
Yeah.
for it's easy to say, okay, whoever he was talking about, maybe it's the
It was
Rams.
for Kyron
Yeah.
for the Rams going up against
Yep.
him. Yeah.
So you kind of know at this point the Eagles front seven is amazing. So are you sitting Kyron Williams that week? Probably not, but you're ranking him a little bit lower, and you're dialing back your projections. The Titans, okay, that's a sort of, I would say, going into it. Well, game flow probably is going to matter here, right? So the Rams probably have a lead in this game. Their lead running back should have an opportunity to get additional carries, maybe some fourth quarter opportunities, against a team that might be struggling. Well, if that game's competitive and that run defense shows up, Kyron Williams may have a very empty box score. He may have, 15 carries for 65 yards and two catches for, 22 yards. And that's not what you're expecting for a guy you're drafting late round two, early round three, and you're frustrated. But everybody ranked him top 10. Everybody said start him in my lineup. He was projected by CBS and ESPN and Yahoo and all these sites that do projections that I'm playing on to score well. Well, why were all these people wrong? Well, the Titans showed up that day, and it's
Right.
just something you got to deal with. So it's all a matter of how you, I think, put it in perspective. And I think the thing about this business and being humble is such a big part of it. If you go in with an arrogant approach of, I don't care that I was wrong, I'll be right next week. Listen to me or don't. Or you say, I was wrong. Here's why I was wrong. I hope I'll be better next week. That's kind of worked for me for, the better part of almost 20 years. And so, um, you shouldn't shy away from your mistakes, and if or your misses. And I think for people that do and just sort of brush it off as it happens, that's, I think, how you build your audience. I think if you can relate to people, because why did you miss? Here's why I missed. Here's why I was wrong. And I think we try to do a good job of that on our show.
I think it's even something that transcends outside of football too. Like when you make mistakes in life, you
Yeah.
learn something from it, you get better at it, right? Like I remember being a kid and the JV coach is like, "Well, we learn more from our losses, boys." And I was like, I'd like to win. That'd be cool, you
Right.
know. But yeah, it's the same thing in fantasy, right? And I think not everyone has that same humble attitude that you're talking about, but I think that's what makes us better at the game, right? Is to be able to learn from those mistakes. That's honestly a big reason why I wanted to do this podcast, was not to necessarily learn from mistakes, but just learn from other people's viewpoints, right? Like we have to kind of be able to say we don't have all the answers. And I think that people playing fantasy oftentimes understand that themselves. They don't have all the answers. The analyst I'm asking doesn't have all the answers. Let's just try to piece together as many, points as we can. With that in mind, and maybe this isn't the answer, but what's one thing that you would love to see more of in fantasy football? It doesn't necessarily have to be from like analysts or industry people. It could just be something in leagues that you want to see a little bit more of.
I love when leagues, do things to enhance their scoring or, change the lineups. I try and play as many different leagues as I can, so IDP leagues, I tell people this all the time with like our IDP league. It helps me understand the game better because now I'm looking at, defensive players from a different perspective. Not that I don't look at defenses, but just, individual players and things like that. Um, you know, the thing that I think people get somewhat frustrated with, especially when they're not having success, is make it different. The I love what Scott Fish does. Okay, now we're gonna do a third round reversal. What? you know,
Right.
we're gonna, kickers are gonna matter this year. Kickers aren't gonna matter this year. Return yards gonna matter. Like change it up. It
It
makes
should be
it more
fun.
fun.
Like it's a game about a game. It's supposed to be
Yes,
fun.
yes. Especially, I get the benefit of people who have played on our site since I've been in this job. So reading good advice, crappy advice, fun stories, bad stories, whatever the case may be for stuff that I've written. And hey, what can we do to make our league better? Go from full PPR to half PPR. You know, add another receiver, make it a super flex league. That to me is fun. And some people don't like it, don't like change. My oldest league went from non PPR to PPR, and I think everybody loved it. So when we first started back in, it was still in college. So it was, or no, post college, I think. So like 2002, 2003, we started. Um, it was non PPR league, and it was just like by the time until we changed, it was like, oh, again. But once we changed, it was like, oh, okay, and everybody loved it. And so change it up every now and then. You don't have to do the same thing year over year, especially if it's just redraft and everybody's not, doing. Or make it a keeper league.
Yeah.
There's just so many different ways to make this. That, like you said, it's a game within a game. Make the game fun.
I've tried that so many times with the home league, the guys that like I went to college with, and it has remained the exact same 10-man PPR, two running backs, two wide receivers, one flex, the exact same thing, just every single year. I think the one year I was like, why don't we do a second flex? Guys was like, what? No, absolutely not. I think I suggested super flex one time, and one of the commissioner of the league was just like, the NFL doesn't play with two quarterbacks, so why would we? And I'm like, that's quite literally the dumbest thing you could tell me right
Yep.
now. But yeah, man, like it's fun. If you're not having fun, I think and I will say that has been a theme through every episode of this show that I have done, is that every person has said this should be fun.
Yeah.
If it's not fun, you're doing it wrong.
Yep.
Just reconnect with what you're doing. And speaking of that, let's fast forward all the way. Jamey Eisenberg is 98 years old. He is riding off into the sunset. No longer doing fantasy analyst. He's gonna finally go take a vacation, maybe chill on a beach somewhere. What is it that you want to be remembered for your time in this industry?
Whew, it's a great question. I guess probably bringing a, I don't say journalistic because there's a lot of great writers, so that kind of gets lost in the world, but like word. But I think you've heard kind of like what my approach is, to how I do this job, and sort of, um, it's very fun for me. So I haven't been to the combine in a few years, but like to see all the fantasy analysts that were at the combine for the couple years I was there. So like Jake Seeley was there, Matthew Berry was there, Mike Clay was there, and I don't think that's anything as a result of me being in this business. But I know, like, for when I started, it was, and again, the industry's changed tremendously. But like, you want to see people at NFL events if
Right.
they have the opportunity to, and you want to see people taking advantage of access to certain things, and it's totally different. I mean, think about the people that I referenced: somebody from the Athletic, somebody from ESPN, the Godfather of fantasy, and Matthew Berry. So they can do what they want. I mean, not everybody has those opportunities. But like, when you have the the background that I have, so to not just make it a numbers based game. And I know I'm not by any means reluctant to trusting analytics. That's just stupid. But for, like, you got to watch what you're playing, right? You got to watch the games.
Yeah.
You got to read, which is, I think, a word that gets lost every now and then. You got to read about these teams. You got to, sort of, dive into what people are saying. And and you brought, we're talking about AI, that humans are the variables that hopefully will still matter. Um, I think there's such a human element to this that, if you can sort of, remember that it's not just numbers, numbers, numbers. And listen, the analytics about this game, the people that only use analytics, they're awesome. And
Yeah.
we
Brilliant
don't
minds.
do, I think, our justice, if you're not following those things. But it just can't all be an analytical process. And I guess, what I would like to be remembered for is not always being an analytical, analyst, and somebody that relies on the human element, I guess.
I love that. I love that. And you used the word earlier that I love, and I try to almost work it in once a show, which is just intangible, because there is so much that is just intangible to this game, and just even just football itself. We're always searching for the skeleton key, this thing that's just going to solve fantasy football, and it just doesn't exist, guys. Like, there's no cheat code that we've got it. Sure, we've got a lot of concepts that help, but I think it's that intangibility that you talk about, and it's people, and like getting to understand how those people work is huge. There's actually a big psychology to it, even within your own leagues, like how you trade with someone, how everything.
Oh, I get
And
laughed at all the time about revenge games and players playing in their hometowns. I've talked to players about this. They get up for it. It's
yeah,
it's such a huge part of, it's like a running joke at times. But you actually talk to NFL players, and they're like, "I'm going back to where I played in high school. I'm going back to where I grew up. Like, yeah, I'm going to
it's
play
real.
a little bit
Jerry
more." Well, why don't
Judy
you do that all the time?
playing against the Broncos.
That's the follow-up question. Why don't you do that all the time? Why does it take that? He's like, it's just different. They'll say it's just different. Like, you're I mean, think about this. Like, I know you just had a situation where your mom, I think, came to visit you, or,
Mhm.
helped you out. Like, how much better did that make you feel? Like, seeing your family,
Oh, it's amazing.
right? It just changes things, and so, like, I remember the first revenge game I ever wrote about. This is, again, how old I am. It was Heinz Ward playing the Falcons in Georgia, in Atlanta, and he had just this monstrous game. And I was like, "Oh, he played at Georgia. Oh, okay, maybe that's what it was." And he talked about it. He's like, "Yeah, I didn't get many opportunities to play in the state of Georgia, and it was big." I was like, "Oh, okay, I got to keep an eye on that." So it's like, contract years. Well, why do these guys play better in contract? I mean, it's just all these things. It's easy to just sort of throw that out the window, because it's not always perfect, but okay,
Yeah,
maybe it
I mean
works
that's why Lamar
every.
Jackson is killing the Dolphins every year. He's coming back
Yeah.
home to Miami.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's such an intangible part of this game, and like it's. I love that you say, like, to remember that it's people, and it's the game itself is comprised of people, and then this game about a game is so comprised of people, and we got some really some of these are very strong analytical questions, and some of these are really fun questions. So I always like to finish off a little rapid fire mailbag here for you. And the first one I got is from Jeremy, the Reddit moderator for the fantasy football page, who asks, "What is it about the CBS fantasy team that's kept the same group of guys together for so long?"
Um, I think, we're a pretty good balance of, analysts, of how we sort of approach it.
Mhm.
Listen, we've had some changes throughout the years. We had Nando Defino for a few years. We lost him. We had Nathan Zagura, who's Now he's the play-by-play guy for the Browns on the radio. Had him for several years. Our hosts have changed, on our video side of things. Dave and I have been lucky enough to be together, for almost again 20 years at this point, which is amazing. It's like we fight like brothers. Love each other and all those things, but we have our arguments and disagreements. It's just we the place that we work for is amazing, and when you get that of bosses who support you, and I can't tell you the number of times, I hope it never changes, where we've gone through different leadership, and almost every time somebody new comes in, they say the same thing: we know you guys are fine. If you ever need me, let us know. And can't ask for a better situation like that. Like, we don't make waves in the in our place. We go about, we're always, for the most part, I'm probably the most guilty on time. But we do what we're supposed to do, and they allow us the freedom to be, a very successful show, a very successful, content, place, and just couldn't be luckier to be doing this as long as I have.
The execs from CBS are not listening, Jamey. You don't have to say all that stuff. I guess you actually mean it. All right, cool. Yeah. No, I mean, it seems like a great place to work. You guys have this camaraderie that I think is actually very reminiscent of fantasy leagues themselves, where people are going to disagree and people, like you said, are going to fight like brothers and all that. And I think there's that connection that you have with an audience. That's why you guys have been together for so long. It's that connection with each other. It connects with the audience and makes it relatable. And that's
Yep.
what it is. Like, it just boils back down to being people. Um, I got another question here from the retro coach on Blue Sky, who said, what is the number one variable about a team's offense that might sway a draft pick between two players that are in the same tier? So he's given some examples like strength of schedule, weather, playoff schedule, offensive line quality, stuff like that. What tends to be sort of a deciding factor for you?
So I'll go back to a player we talked about on our show on Thursday, Jonathan Taylor versus Josh Jacobs, right?
Yeah.
You were put those guys on the same team. I think everybody's taking Jonathan Taylor over Josh Jacobs. Jacobs' team is probably going to score more points. He's going to catch more passes. He's going to play behind a better offensive line. Obviously, has better quarterback play. So for me, I'm ranking Jacobs one spot ahead of Jonathan Taylor. And so those are decisions I think that you look at and you say, okay, receivers, who's got a better quarterback, who's going to get more targets, who's going to, maybe see less of a tougher coverage because of the role that he plays. Is he the X, is he the Y, is he the Z, is he playing in the slot, all those things. So yeah, I think all those things, come down to on draft day. This is the fun of drafts. Like, so you start to build your rank list, and then it's like, okay, why do I like this player versus player? I don't know how much you change your rankings. I change them almost every hour. It's just like,
All the time.
Adam asked us this question. He's like, what? There's nothing happening. Why are you changing your rankings? I said, every draft I do, and I come to a decision of player X versus player Y. And then I'm debating it. And I'm like, well, if I like player Y better than player Z, why do I have Z, X or whatever? You get the point. Why do I have
Yeah.
that player ranked ahead of the other one? And I just go back and I change it. Like right now I'm writing tiers for our site. And I must have changed 1,000 things just because like this guy doesn't belong in this spot, and I'd rather have this guy over this guy. And it's like, you're just dissecting all this stuff. So all these variables matter. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's something that I think the best quote I got from, or not best quote I got from him, but one of my favorites that I got from Sigmund Bloom is that you really don't figure out your rankings until you're sitting in a draft,
Yes.
and you'll have everything in order, and then you go and draft, and you're like, well, I prefer that guy, and then you're like, well, okay, it's exactly what you said. Why do I have him behind this other player if I didn't want him? I try to like do the mental gymnastics of, well, that guy's got upside, so
Yeah.
might project him for more points. That's why I got him ranked higher. It's just like, no,
Yep.
man, just put exactly what you want on there. All right, these final two questions get super, super duper serious, and well, you might know this one. I think David Richard is probably how
I
it's
know him.
pronounced.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Yeah, seems like a smart fella. Um, I don't even know how you're going to answer this question or how I ask this question. He says, how would the bidding war go for Jamar Chase in an auction draft if the Waterboy and Chewbacca were both auctioning back and forth and really wanted him?
So Dave likes my two impressions of Chewbacca and the Waterboy. So I won't do the auction debate, but I'll give you both. So Chewbacca, we were just in Disney with the kids. Every time we do Star Tours, I like to do Chewbacca when they close the door and make some kids in the room laugh. So it's just pretty simple, So
Beautiful.
it's
Good technique.
a little better in person, but I'll spare you the sound effects. And then the water boy is so I if I had the chance to see Vicky Valancourt, I would tell her that she had some very very good H2O and yeah, I like football, but Mama said it's not just the safest thing for me.
Perfect, man. Well, okay, where's this hidden talent coming from? Have you always been good at just doing impressions, or is this just like the two that you got in the chamber?
These are definitely the two in the chamber. You try and be a little different every now and then. It's
Yeah,
again just whatever hits you. Adam Sandler's pretty easy one to do, just because he's
it's kind
a
of the same
cookie for me,
character.
a cookie for you. Let's
Yeah.
have a cookie and a big round chew.
Yeah,
um,
same guy.
yeah.
All right, man. Last question on here. This is from Mike Cash over on Twitter, who asks, if you had to go to a dinosaur infested island, which character from any Jurassic Park or Jurassic World movie are you bringing with you?
Oh boy, I haven't seen the new one yet, so I don't know all the characters
Eh,
from that one. I mean, obviously, I don't know their names, but Chris Pratt's character from the last two movies, he seemed to be very good at surviving and taming dinosaurs and fighting them whenever he had to. And then I guess the guy from the first three movies, or at least two of the first three movies, um, with the hat, whatever his name
which
was.
Dr. Alan Grant,
Yes,
like our guy that takes off the sunglasses.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Or I guess Jeff Goldblum too. I mean, the fact that he was able to maneuver his way with a little sense of humor. Um, but I mean, I guess if you're going to take somebody, you want somebody obviously going to get you through the situation, right? So
Yeah.
I'd be the first person to die most likely, but the guy on Star Trek with the red shirt. But anytime you have somebody that's got the survival skills, I'm sure Scarlett Johansson is probably that person in the new movies. You want to you need somebody to navigate you through a terrible situations. So go with the tried and true.
There we go. Man, it's been a lot of fun. This has been a lot of fun. I know we've been here for a little while, but last thing here that I love to do is just, please. I think everyone listening knows exactly who you are, where they can find your work. But you mentioned some articles that you're doing and things that you might have coming up. So please just let everybody know what you guys, what you're working on currently, and what you have coming up over at CBS.
So finishing up tiers for this week. Quarterback and running back is already on CBSSports.com, and wide receiver, if I get my job done, will be done by the end of the day. Tight ends by Friday. I probably wrote a little bit too much. I'm sure that's what our bosses will say. So stop writing as much. But I try to write something about every receiver and every running back. I think I did there's 100 receivers there. It's a lot. Yeah. If you want to know about, trying to think of the most obscure.
You got any
Had
Tutu
Knight Mitchell.
Atwell in there?
Who?
You got any Tutu Atwell in there?
Of course. I mean, so Tutu Atwell, Sean McVay. Here's an intangible. Sean McVay said he felt he didn't do a good enough job of getting Tutu the ball more when everybody was healthy last year, and is I think trying to justify the $10 million contract that he gave him. That was the question posed to him, like why did you pay Tutu so much? And so we'll see if that comes to fruition. But there's something he got
There we
got a
go.
nice contract for a guy that hasn't produced very much as a wide receiver. And we'll see if Tutu can deliver in 2025. But yes, there's a lot of stuff on wide receiver tiers coming up on the site. And then just check out our podcast. It's a lot of great podcasts in the industry, yours as well.
Thank you.
But we we do it every day, and it's a very 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 fortuitous thing for me to be able to be a part of that.
Yeah, man. I think that's the biggest thing from myself and from everyone that's been here is just gratuity and just being thankful for this thing that we get to do every single day. And I think for many of us, it's sort of living out a dream in
Yep.
many aspects, man. But seriously, thank you so much. This was awesome to get to. I got to learn from you. I know the audience got to learn from you a little bit as well. And it was just a pleasure having you on, man. So thank you so much, Jamey. And for everybody that's watched or listened all the way through, as always, I want to thank you guys. See you next time. Adios.